Hello. Today I want to talk about limiting beliefs. I think this is a phrase that most people are familiar with, the idea that sometimes we have ideas, beliefs sort of stuck in our mind in a way that it holds us back from doing things that we'd like to in our lives, hence the idea that a belief is limiting, it's stopping us moving forward. And, these sorts of beliefs come in all shapes and sizes, but often they're things that we learned about ourselves when we were very young. So one of my favourite examples of this is one that is very common. So have a think about when you were a small child, did someone, and it could have been a parent or it could have been an older sibling or a teacher or somebody, did somebody ever say to you, don't speak to strangers? I imagine they probably did. So when you're 5 years old, or 6 years old or whatever, that's probably quite a good principle to have in life. Don't speak to strangers. And what happens is that as a result of that, you end up with the idea that strangers are in some way dangerous to you. They're not to be trusted. Which again, when you're 5 years old, that maybe isn't such a bad thing. But what about when you're 25 or 35 or 45? Is it still a good idea to be thinking that strangers are dangerous or that you shouldn't speak to strangers? See, for most people, as part of their work, they often meet new people. They often meet strangers. And yet, we know that it's okay as an adult to meet somebody that you haven't met before and chat to them and get to know them and so on. But how many people, and if you're honest with yourself, has this happened to you? Have you ever found yourself going into a big gathering, whether it's a conference or some kind of social event where you don't know anybody and feeling really uncomfortable? And is that because somewhere in the back of your mind there's a little 5-year-old going, don't speak to strangers? So that's an example of a limiting belief. And I think it's a great example because it's one that a lot of people can relate to. And, if I said to you, how old were you when someone said to you, that's okay, you can speak to strangers now, I'm guessing that nobody ever did. And even if they had, it probably wouldn't have made any difference because by that time, that belief was well ingrained. So a lot of otherwise very intelligent, competent, sensible, confident adults sometimes find themselves a little bit uncomfortable going into a situation where they're about to meet a lot of strangers. And that's the reason why. So people often say to me, so what do we do about it? Well, if you're a qualified NLP practitioner, then you'll have tools and techniques that you can use in order to get rid of a limiting belief and to change that particular pattern in your thought process. But if you don't have all those tools, what do you do about it? Well, the good news is that just by becoming aware of it, you're already on the right track. I think this is a bit like house bricks. If you think about a house made of brick, when you look at the house, all you see is the house. You don't think about all the individual bricks. But if one of those bricks becomes loose and starts to work its way out of the building, then it becomes separate. You draw your attention to it. And now it's no longer part of the house. Now it's a loose brick. And it's the same way with a belief that has been part of your belief system. And then one day you look at it and you say, I think that's holding me back. That isn't necessarily true. Because in order to be able to say, I think it's holding me back, you have to recognise that it isn't necessarily true. And as soon as you do that, it's as if you loosen the mortar around the brick and it becomes loose. Now, in order to take the brick out fully, obviously other things have to happen. Because however much you may be aware that something isn't necessarily true, there may be situations in which it's such a habit that it guides your behaviour and it guides your thought process that it takes a bit more effort than that to actually finally get rid of it. But just by bringing it into the daylight and looking at it and saying to yourself, that isn't necessarily true, you are already on the way to reducing its hold over you. And then the next thing that you can do is play with the words, play with how you think about it. So going back to the example of thinking that you shouldn't speak to strangers, if you were to adjust the language of that, and rather than thinking, don't speak to strangers, think, speak to people I know, or speak to people that I don't yet know, or it's okay to get to know new people. Just play around with the words until you've got some different patterns of things that you can say to yourself in the circumstance. And if that doesn't work, well, you can always use the NLP techniques.